New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani is sworn into office and gives an inaugural speech that's a socialist manifesto, including promising to embrace New Yorkers with the warmth of collectivism.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague on the Journal's opinion pages, Matt Continetti, who writes for the WSJ's new Free Expression newsletter. Shortly after midnight on Thursday morning, 34-year-old Zohran Mamdani took office as the new mayor of New York City. Opening remarks at his inaugural on the steps of City Hall were delivered by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Then Mamdani was sworn in by Bernie Sanders. And if that wasn't indication enough that Mamdani does not intend to back away from his socialism, he also promised to govern expansively and audaciously. Here's another line. No longer will City Hall hesitate to use its powers to improve New Yorkers' lives. And then here's another. When a city belongs to the people, there is no need too small to be met. Let's listen to a bit of Mamdani's speech.
We will overcome the isolation that too many feel and connect the people of this city to one another. The cost of childcare will no longer discourage young adults from starting a family, because we will deliver universal childcare for the many by taxing the wealthiest few. Those in rent-stabilized homes will no longer dread the latest rent hike, because we will freeze the rent. Getting on a bus without worrying about a fare hike or whether you'll be able to get to your destination on time will no longer be deemed a small miracle, because we will make those buses fast and free.
Matt, welcome. Happy New Year. What did you make of the New York mayor's inaugural speech there?
Happy New Year to you, Kyle. It's great to be here. Well, I guess my take on Mamdani as he becomes mayor is that he's can be personally charming but politically revolting. And so this is probably the first inaugural speech I've ever heard with the reference to Jadakiss in it. But that speaks to his kind of millennial background as someone who's 34 years old. He has a definite connection with certain parts of the city that he kind of spiced his speech up with. That is kind of charming. But then you get to what he's actually saying. And it is straight out of a failed playbook of New York mayoralties. I was struck by a few things. The first is he cited as exemplars his predecessors, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who, of course, governed about a decade, 4 years ago, left office, and David Dinkins, the mayor from the early 1990s, whose mayoralty was so disastrous that it ushered in Rudy Giuliani. He also mentioned Fiorello LaGuardia, kind of a historic figure back from the progressive age. But it's fascinating to me that Mamdani would reference two mayors who are, I think, by any standard, failures in terms of how they left the city. When you think of public safety, when you think of the city's finances, when you think of the state of the economy. And so this brings home to me the fact that Mamdani is truly an anti-Giuliani. He's someone who is entering office dedicated to undoing or enacting the exact opposite policies as Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, whose mayoralty in the 1990s, of course, created a renaissance in New York City that lasted for a solid 2 decades. So I think this was a disturbing speech on many levels. You know, there was a lot of anticipation, Kyle. I'm sure you saw it too in the press and the lead-up articles in the Atlantic and the New Yorker and other elite publications asking, well, how will Mamdani govern? We really don't know. He's such a mystery. No, he's not. He's a conviction politician, and his convictions are socialist. He went out of his way to say it. He's going to govern as a democratic socialist. As you mentioned at the top of the show, he was sworn in by Bernie Sanders. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, unlike Mamdani, can run for president in 2028, gave a stirring socialist address during the proceedings. And one other thought, you know, his references are not American. I've looked back at his victory speech, and I could talk a little bit more about that later. But in his victory speech, the politician he cited through quotation, it was Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister of India. And then in his inaugural speech yesterday, Mamdani said, well, who will run the city? Who will New York City belong to? Well, we can take inspiration from Madiba, Nelson Mandela. And instead of citing the Declaration of Independence or any of America's foundational charters of government, he cited the South African Freedom Charter, which I looked up. I did some research. It was the creation of the South African anti-apartheid movement back in the 1950s. So he's a politician whose references are outside America. Of course, as he's an immigrant, so that might play some role in that. But he's definitely not referring to the American political tradition. He's a socialist, and he's 34 years old. And I think we're headed for disaster in New York.
I would agree with you on both sides of that ledger. I mean, my take on the speech is that he is a very dynamic speaker. There were some grace notes written into the speech. He had a nice line about the outgoing mayor, Eric Adams, being a son of Brownsville who rose from washing dishes to the highest position in our city. That's a kind of classy thing to say about the guy that you defeated, who is standing there and came to your inauguration. Nice political moment there. But remarkable the extent to which he is embracing this idea that socialism is the answer for New Yorkers, their problems, big and small, no matter how small. Listen to this second clip of Mamdani.
We will draw this city closer together. We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism. If our campaign demonstrated that the people of New York yearn for solidarity, then let this government foster it. Because no matter what you eat, how you pray, or where you come from, the words that most define us are the two we all share: New Yorkers.
Another line that jumped out at me is his explanation of what he wants to do and raising the bar for public services. So he said, for too long, we have turned to the private sector for greatness while accepting mediocrity from those who serve the public. He then went on to say, we expect greatness from the cooks wielding 1,000 spices, from those who stride out onto Broadway stages, from our starting point guard at Madison Square Garden. Let us demand the same from those who work in government. And Matt, it's almost as if he has not read or is even unaware of the critiques of socialism and public services viewed that way. I mean, the obvious difference of the chefs who are all competing in a marketplace where consumers have the choice of whether I'm going to go to this restaurant or that restaurant. That is the reason that is the mechanism for demanding greatness from our chefs, is that those who do not perform at a high level, they can't make it. They have to go do something else. It is not a system in which people get hired to be a chef, and then they have the chefs public sector union standing up for them, giving them essentially tenure protections, bargaining with the restaurant owner over the exact layout of the kitchen and all of their work requirements and their hours and so forth. It's just a totally different system. And so I hear what he's saying. I would love to raise the bar for public services and go into a post office or a city office and be able to expect the kind of service that you get from a high quality restaurant. But it just seems to ignore the differences between what the government is and why it's not good at doing the kinds of things that the private sector does well.
Right. I mean, for all the socialist animosity toward monopoly, they always conveniently ignore the greatest monopoly of all, and that is the state. Government is the biggest monopoly because government has monopoly over the powers of coercion. And so this completely escapes Mamdani's ideology. He just can't see it. I was also struck by another line where he kind of invoked a strong man and said, to those who say the era of big government is over, blah, blah, blah. I think he said, we're going to prove that government is always going to be there. Well, first, the last politician to say the era of big government is over was President Bill Clinton, who said it 30 years ago, actually, this year, in his State of the Union in 1996. And I don't think any New York mayor has said that the era of big government is over for a century, at least, because one problem New York does not have is too little government. You have a city with a budget in the hundreds of billions of dollars. You have many, many thousands of municipal employees. And as you say, Kyle, you have the power of government unions, which have tied New York up in knots with regulations. And nowhere in Mamdani's political career has he ever espoused any desire to increase competition and choice. Those are principles that are anathema to him. To follow up on Clinton, I thought it was also interesting that this speech was the first political text of, I think, the post-Obama Democratic Party. Because if you look at it, there's that one reference to Clinton, okay, and it's against Clinton, and there's no reference to Obama. It's very hard for me to think of a Democrat who in the past almost 2 decades, since Obama first came into public light with his stirring speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention, wasn't trying to capture the kind of Obama appeal, this post-partisan appeal, the sense that America is somehow beyond disagreement and that Obama, of course, knows the way and we're going to be civil and we're going to come together, always, of course, on Obama's side of the issues. That was missing from this speech. This is Bernie Sanders' son. He had Sanders there. He mentioned him again in his text. This is not Clinton. This is not Obama. This is Bernie Sanders' Democratic Party that Zohran Mamdani is now the most prominent spokesman for. I mean, he's not in the legislature, in the federal legislature, like Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He's actually running things. He's running America's greatest city. And so I think if we want to see where the Democratic Party could be headed, or at least a significant part of the Democratic Party, you look at this speech and you see it in a very different light than the Democratic Party that maybe you and I have become used to over the past decades.
There was no tempering from Mamdani on his socialism, but I also thought it was interesting, Matt, that there was no tempering from him either on any effort to lower expectations or under promise and then over deliver might be another way of saying it. I mean, campaigns are famously about promising voters the moon, and many politicians then come into office and discover that the powers that they sort of implied that they would have if the voters put them there are not actually the powers of the office. So I was a little bit, surprised, maybe too strong, but notable to me that Mamdani is not making any effort to change to water down the things that he promised voters on the campaign trail. And a couple of them we can pull on. I mean, his promise to freeze the rent depends on this rent stabilization board in New York City. Headline over the last month or so that outgoing Mayor Eric Adams quickly appointed 4 people to that rent board. So Mamdani is going to have to either try to work with them, at least for the first period of his time in office, or try to, I don't know, create some sort of legal controversy about whether those appointments are valid or not to get his own members on that board. We've talked to some on this podcast about whether Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, will help Mamdani with the kinds of tax increases that he has promised that require some sort of help from Albany. And then just instances where he is maybe fighting the laws of economics. So also on Thursday, Mamdani went to an apartment building where he says that there's an issue there. There's been residents who've complained about disrepair. So there's I'm reading from this New York Times story about it. It says shortly after his inauguration, he visited a rent-stabilized building in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn. Some residents have stopped paying rent because of their frustrations with the building's disrepair, tiles falling off the walls, pipes rusting, and so forth. And then, Matt, you get to maybe halfway down the story and they explain that the owner of this building has declared bankruptcy. And so that does not suggest to me an issue of where this is the rent is too high. It does not seem like the owner of this building has been gouging its tenants. If they've declared bankruptcy, which is probably, you would assume, related to the fact that the building is falling into disrepair, which is a classic a result of these kinds of rent control laws, because if you can't charge market rent as the owner of the building, one place where you end up seeing that is in disrepair and lack of updates, lack of renovations, because the renovations that go into making a building attractive and competitive are A, expensive, and B, the kinds of things that you can no longer afford if you are maybe getting only a certain amount under market value of the rent of those properties, and C, if you have people who are locked into those apartments because they're getting such a great rate on the rent, hundreds or thousands of dollars below what that apartment would go for otherwise, those people are less likely to move, meaning you don't have to compete in the housing marketplace. And so it's notable to me that Mamdani is sticking with all his promises. He's making no effort to tell people, it's just beware. I promised a lot of stuff on the campaign trail. It's going to take a while. We're going to have to make sure we can get Albany on board. There's no effort to prepare voters for what the powers of the office, the limitations of them.
Now, he had that line in his speech where he said, actions speak louder than words. And I guess maybe he interprets that line to mean that he can say whatever he wants. And at the end of the day, people are just going to judge him by the results. So far, the results aren't very promising. It seems to me that if you wanted to showcase the need for more rent stabilized apartments, you would go to a non-rent stabilized apartment building that is in disrepair and say, look how rent stabilization could improve it. Of course, that's hard to find because, as you say, the incentives in a non-rent stabilized apartment are for higher quality, right? Are for better accommodations. Whereas with the rent stabilized apartments, not only do they create shortages by taking units off the market, there are no incentives for the owners to maintain the housing in an attractive condition. What Mamdani doesn't have is an understanding of economic incentives. A few socialists do. I was just musing as you were speaking, Kyle, that some enterprising American should start airdropping copies of Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson over the 5 boroughs, like we do, with pro-freedom texts over North Korea, just in order to maybe have the possibilities that someone working for Mamdani or connected to him would begin to understand the difference between what you see and what you don't see, and the importance of incentives in economic behavier. But
we can start Voice of America back up and start beaming
right, direct it toward New York City. Exactly. A couple things that struck me about the agenda. What I didn't see in the speech was any reference to the to the grocery stores, to the government-run grocery stores. He seems to be really doubling down instead on the free childcare, the rent freeze, and then the fast and free buses. And he might need Kathy Hochul's help to push some of those buses, because I don't know how he's going to make them fast. You can socialize the cost and maybe make them free, but I don't know how you make them fast. What wasn't in the speech, in addition to the government-run grocery stores, was the national focus that you saw in his victory speech. So when you compare and contrast the victory speech with the inaugural speech, you see that the victory speech was really building on one of the reasons Mamdani was elected, and that was opposition to President Trump. He used his opposition to President Trump and President Trump's descriptions of him as a communist who would wreck the city as kind of fuel in his campaign against Andrew Cuomo. And when he gave his victory speech, it was a lacerating attack on Donald Trump. He addressed Donald Trump directly several times. He said that if Donald Trump wanted to get to Mamdani, he'd have to go through all of America. It was extremely oppositional rhetoric. There's only one mention of Donald Trump yesterday by Mamdani, and it was a very interesting one. He was talking about the different types of people who supported him. And he said, maybe you were somebody who had just voted for Donald Trump the year before, but now you voted for me as mayor because you were disappointed in the party establishment. So this was a beginning of a turn, or perhaps a continuation of one that began with that slightly odd meeting between Mamdani and Trump in the Oval Office last year. But he seems to be, if not narrowing the scope of his ambitions, definitely kind of focusing on the local for now, as opposed to the national implications of his mayoralty.
One other thing that stuck out for me from the speech was Mamdani's many references to the diversity of New York City, all the different people who live in this great city, and the foods that they eat, the languages they speak, and including references to New York's many Jewish residents. And I wonder what you made of those. So here is a line. He said, "While only action can change minds, I promise you this: if you are a New Yorker, I am your mayor. Regardless of whether we agree, I will protect you, celebrate with you, mourn alongside you, and never for a second hide from you." And Matt, I wonder how much you think that will allay or not concerns about anti-Semitism rising in New York City. I mean, in November, there was this protest outside the Park East Synagogue in Manhattan. Protesters, chanting "Globalize the Intifada" at people walking into the synagogue. I mean, do you have any sense of whether Mayor Mamdani, as he now is going to be willing to stand up and say, that is not what New York City stands for?
Yeah. Well, actions change minds, right? That's what he said. And look at his actions. Not long after taking the oath of office in public, he signed an executive order that revoked all of the executive orders issued by Mayor Adams after Mayor Adams' indictment in 2024. The charges were later dropped. And he said that was the moment, according to Mamdani, when New Yorkers lost faith in the Adams administration. Among those orders that the new mayor revoked was one committing New York City to the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, the so-called IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's a controversial definition. Some people say that it implicates the First Amendment. I happen to disagree. I think it applies to conduct, not speech. But this is one that includes within its definition criticism of Israel, or rather the delegitimization and demonization and application of double standards to the state of Israel in isolation. You only focus on Israel. You don't focus on any other country. And of course, one reason Mamdani might want to revoke New York City's association with the IRA definition is, under the IRA definition, he's an anti-Semite, because I don't think he does recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. He also did away with Eric Adams' repudiation of the boycott, divest, sanctions movement, an international campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction the state of Israel. So here we have the BDS movement, which Mamdani has been part of since he was in college. And he's going to, I think, move toward adopting that view toward Israel. What Mamdani is trying to do, it seems to me, is separate Jewish identity from love of the state of Israel and support for the state of Israel. So he's going to say, look, if you put a Nazi symbol on a synagogue, that's anti-Semitic. But if you are outside a synagogue where people from organizations that help promote and assist American Jews or Jews from all over the world migrate to the state of Israel, and you're chanting "Globalize the Intifada" and you're talking about eliminating settlers, that's not necessarily anti-Semitic in Mamdani's view. This is a dangerous wedge because Israel is the national home of the Jewish people. There are deep ties between Jews of all national origins and the state of Israel. And if Mamdani is allowed to get away with this, I think that anti-Semitism on the left and the right is going to continue to fester and weaken this great country of ours.
Matt, we give it the last word today, but how much do you think that Mamdani will be followed by other Democrats as a leader in the party? I mean, notably, Seattle is also swearing in a socialist mayor, and no doubt Republicans, as these midterms 2026 approach, are going to be talking a lot about what is happening in the now socialist cities of New York City and Seattle. On the other hand, the mayor of New York City is not famously a launch pad for political careers, and part of that may be the difficulty of the job. Unlike getting yourself elected, senator, where you get up and make some speeches and take some votes and aren't responsible for actually making anything happen. As the mayor of New York, if the garbage doesn't picked up, that's you. If the snow doesn't get plowed, that's you. If there's problems in the housing market, all of that is you. And so it is a tough gig being mayor of New York City. And I mean, maybe some of the answer to the question will just depend on the results that Mamdani is able to get or not over the next year or so. But it is notable that you have this rising faction, as you call them, of the post-Obama Democrats.
Right. Yeah. The socialists in the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Socialists of America, it's a separate organization that seems to be worming its way into the Democratic Party, have been very successful at the municipal level. And that makes sense, because America's cities today are kind of these postmodern places where you have extremely rich individuals who actually tend to kind of skew progressive in the cultural politics of today. And then you have what some have called the precariat, kind of either immigrants or second generation immigrants, or young people who come to the cities right after college. They're kind of in entry-level jobs. They're trying to work their way up, but they find it hard. Why? Because all of these places, as we've said, are hugely affected by government interventions, whether it's the power of the government unions, whether it's the regulations, whether it's the high levels of progressive taxation. Those are the very policies that drive most of the middle class away to red America, to be frank about it. So the nature of our cities have made it very appetizing to the socialists. What I haven't seen is the DSA breakout beyond the cities. And so what I think we're going to have happen is Mamdani will be, he's going to be a major figure in our politics for the next 4 years, simply because New York, the greatest city in America, also the media capital of the United States of America. And a lot of our reporters, it's no secret to you, Kyle, lean left. And so they have a great interest in Mamdani, and they want to champion his chances of success. So he's going to loom large in our politics. But I think what you're actually going to see instead is a very vicious fight for the 2028 Democratic nomination that's going to pit Sanders' successors. And that it's not going to be Mamdani, but it could well be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It could be some other figure who will pop up in the next 2 years, who's going to try to take the mantle of Bernie Sanders in that kind of anti-establishment socialist campaign for the Democratic nomination that he waged in 2016 and 2020. He scared the Democratic establishment in both campaigns. They're going to see that happen again. And that's going to put a figure, say, like Gavin Newsom, the California governor, who wants to have the broadest possible coalition to win the Democratic nomination in 2028, in a bind, because he's going to have to see how he can take some of this post-Obama coalition I'm describing to get their support in the nomination without laying down markers that would alienate the broad American middle and middle class in a general election. We see a preview of that, of course, as the page has been writing about in the debate over a California state-based wealth tax, just a incredibly ruinous policy, and that Newsom is going to have to decide where he's going to land. So I think that's where we'll see the fight play out. Look, the Democratic establishment has proved resilient over the past decade in kind of thwarting these attempted socialist takeovers. But, as we see all the time in history, the luck of the establishment eventually runs out.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.